Hello, my name is Carl. I'm an architect and a amateur history urbanism enthusiast, and I've decided to make a video comparing the growth of two cities that I am familiar with, St. Louis, Missouri, and Chicago, Illinois. Um, what to say about them? They're about 300 miles apart. Before I get into the maps, which I'll start in 1764, which was the founding of the city of St. Louis. Chicago came later in 1837. Um, but let's go back a little bit further to give you just some geographical, historical context. Um, Native America, right? St. Louis was always much more of a hub of Native American activity and population because partly it was warmer and it also was more geographically important because of the confluence of the Missouri and Mississippi rivers. Um, and river transportation was big, and confluences of rivers were big. So on the east side here, you have the Cahokia Mounds um, historic site. Here you can see Monk's Mound. This was actually the largest kind of mound city outside of north of Teotihuacan, which is Mexico City. So this was a huge population center that honestly had largely hollowed out by the 1700s when the French came. And the French, it's important to remember, came before the British to the Midwest. They kind of came through the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes region, and then by the 1670s they were exploring the Mississippi River and setting up trade outposts, trading with the Native Americans. And Chicago was not really as important of a fur trading hub. There were Miami Indian Native American villages there, and a little bit of trade activity, but it wasn't until later that Chicago's important geography was appreciated. But Chicago is also sort of a nexus, sort of a confluence of sorts, because it connects the Great Lakes waterway, which is sort of this basin here that drains out through the St. Lawrence River, and it's sort of a quick portage, overland portage to the Mississippi River system, which drains out to the Gulf of Mexico, because you've got the Illinois River kind of snaking up here to close to Lake Michigan. So if you wanted to get connected to those waterways, Chicago was the place to do it. So that's important to remember for a little bit of context, but let's get into the maps. So the first map we have is of St. Louis in 1780, and you can see it's still just a riverfront settlement. It's a fur trading settlement. Pierre Leclerc and Auguste Chateau, the founders of St. Louis, still live here. The buildings butt right up against the river, where the first street was simply a towpath right at the edge of the river, and it's surrounded by fortifications, defensive fortifications, because you still needed to guard against attack. The second map of St. Louis from 1796 shows largely the same city, a bit larger, with a more topography in this version. Funnily, the arrow representing the direction of the river is switched in this one. This was the first printed map of the city, and it was made in secret by the French government. All right, now we've got an 1804 map of the city of St. Louis. The city has 1,200 residents now, and this is a map that shows the legal boundaries and individual lots within the town. It is the first survey of the city. Here we've got Chicago in 1812, just as a comparison to St. Louis. There wasn't as much going on. You've got Fort Dearborn, you've got a remote frontier outpost, basically, at the time. There's some American soldiers, French traders, and Native Americans living here. 1820, St. Louis is starting to boom. Its population grows to 10,000. It expands beyond its military fortifications. You can see Chateau's Pond on the left side, which will eventually get filled. And here we've got Chicago, 13 years later in 1833. Still only a settlement of about 300 people and a few square blocks, but it is starting to expand. Here we've got a cool 1837 map of St. Louis, commissioned by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers for a project that was led by Robert E. Lee to dredge the Mississippi River main channel to become closer to the Missouri side of the river so that St. Louis would be more usable. This map has a lot of interesting detail showing Indian mounds that were eventually destroyed, unfortunately, lime kilns, mills. You can tell this is just a bustling city at this time. 1844, St. Louis is continuing to grow. This population is now at around 40,000. This map shows the city being divided into 6 different wards. Note that you still have Chateau Pond and Duncan Island at this time. Here's both cities in 1855 for a nice side-by-side comparison. St. Louis is still bigger than Chicago, but both cities are just growing rapidly. Whoa, it's 1857. Chicago is booming. It's at 93,000 people. I don't know how this happened, but there weren't a lot of maps between 1830s and 1857, but clearly you can see it's growing at a very fast clip. Here's Chicago 1860. St. Louis 1861. Huge growth in both cities, but the Civil War is just about to happen. Chicago 1868, still just a huge population boom through the 1860s. 1871, the Great Chicago Fire happens, but it's really only a minor setback in the growth of this city. 1873, St. Louis, you can see the brand new Eads Bridge crossing the Mississippi River, which was still not completed until 1874. You can also see that St. Louis and Chicago's populations are about the same at this point. Here's an 1876 map of St. Louis. This is a really important year for St. Louis because it marks when the city and the county split. And it won't prove to be a disaster until many decades later, but it was indeed bad for the city. But you can tell here that it's hardly past Grand Avenue. The city boundaries are way out here past Forest Park, but it will outgrow its boundaries surprisingly quickly. Chicago 1880, you can see that grid is really starting to expand and its population is blowing past St. Louis. You also see the advent of a kind of interconnected park system here between parks and boulevards. So Chicago is becoming quite a sophisticated urbanist city at this point. 1893 in Chicago is at about 1.5 million, and it has just continued its explosive growth. This is also an important year where it hosts the Columbian Expedition, which you can see is noted here in the lower corner. Meanwhile, 1895 St. Louis, you can see it's reached its growth boundaries quite quickly and its population is now constrained. So this is where Chicago starts to really trounce St. Louis. 1908, you've got a larger map of the St. Louis area. Development has progressed on the east side in Illinois as well as into the county with streetcar suburbs like Maplewood here and University City, Clayton. And you can see the city limits are clearly demarcated here, and the growth is starting to continue outside of that. Here's a beautiful 1910 map of Chicago. The city's population has expanded beyond 2 million now. And you can see here, though, these are the extents of the city of Chicago even today. They might have changed just a bit, but you can see streetcar suburbs emerge like Riverside here, Oak Park, Berwyn. So both cities are experiencing the kind of streetcar suburb, proto-suburbia phenomenon of the early 20th century. I'm going to just jump ahead rapidly now. We're in the 1930s. The age of the automobile is upon us. Chicago's city population is over 3 million, but really now it's about the suburbs and the growth of the metropolitan area. 1950s St. Louis, the suburban sprawl continues. You really have the population peak in St. Louis in the 50s, though, and this is the beginning of the hollowing out and the white flight of St. Louis City. Chicago in 1960, the city population is 3.5 million, but the metro population is 6.7 million, so more, almost double that. Just continuing that sprawl trend. And here's St. Louis in the modern day. I've skipped over a lot of development of the metro area, but the overall metro is few million less than Chicago, and the city itself remains to fall in population below 300,000. So I think that there's a lot of hope for the city of St. Louis, and I hope it can turn things around. The time will tell. And Chicago's sprawl as well, although the city population is less than it was in the 1960s. So, future of American cities remains very interesting, but that's a topic for another video. Thank you.